How's it going, guys? Welcome back to another video. I'm going to keep this intro short, but in today's video I am going to be installing a brand new steering rack on my first gen Toyota Sequoia. This video should also apply for first gen Tundras as well. These are the years, I think 2000 to 2006 for the Tundras and 2001 to 2007 for the Toyota Sequoias. The steering rack I'm going to be installing today is from Freelance Fabrications, and I highly recommend checking out Freelance Fab for a couple of reasons. The steering racks they have are OEM steering racks that are professionally rebuilt. It's always recommended to go with an OEM or rebuilt OEM steering rack because lots of the aftermarket ones just typically don't last as long as the OEM steering racks. Along with being a rebuilt OEM steering rack, the Freelance steering rack comes with pre-installed polyurethane bushings. These polyurethane bushings last a lot longer and give a better, stiffer steering feel, and overall are a big upgrade over the stock bushings. If you guys have any comments, questions, or issues, please feel free to reach out and I'll do my best to help you. I am by no means an expert, but I hope this video can kind of help you if you're looking to upgrade your steering rack as well. Thanks so much for tuning in, and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, one of the important things when doing a steering rack is you don't want your steering wheel to move around when the steering rack is removed. So if you have a ratchet strap or just some type of strap, go ahead and secure your steering wheel in place. And if you're wondering, I am just strapping it to this seat bracket on both sides, so it's just hooked from there, and just going to tighten this down, and that will prevent the steering wheel from turning left or right while we're replacing the steering rack. Alright, Sequoia is jacked up. We got the steering wheel secured down. Next step is just to go ahead and take off these wheels. Alright, so with the wheels removed, we can go ahead and start removing the old steering rack. That is the first thing we are going to be doing today, is taking that old steering rack off, getting it out of there, and getting it ready to install the brand new one. So let's go ahead and get this steering rack out. I am planning to start by trying to disconnect the bolts that hold the steering rack in place instead of doing the tie rods. The reason for that is I have done my tie rods somewhat recently when I replaced my lower ball joints. There's a video on that process on my channel, and when I did those lower ball joints, I disconnected the tie rods, so I'm not quite as concerned with those tie rods being seized on there or rusted in place. So before I start pulling all of that stuff apart, I'm going to start with the bolts that hold the steering rack in place. That way, in case I can't get any of those off or they're seized or something happens, I don't have to put the tie rods back on and deal with all of that. And again, before you start messing with the steering rack and disconnecting any of those bolts, just make sure your steering wheel is strapped in place and it's not going to move around. Check this out right here. This is part of the reason I'm doing a new steering rack. If you look at these bushings here that hold the old steering rack in place, watch how much play the steering rack has when I move the wheel back and forth. So look right here in this area. Can you guys see that moving around? It has so much play in it. It wasn't even worth doing an alignment after installing my upper control arms because of how much this moves around. So this is one of the biggest things we'll be fixing by installing the new rack today. Alright, the first bolt we're going to try and disconnect here is the steering column shaft bolt located right here. If you follow the steering rack on the driver's side where it goes up to the steering wheel, just this lower bolt is the one we are going to try and disconnect here. I'm hoping this isn't too seized on there. Yep, it is a 12mm bolt, so let's go ahead and see if we can remove this. Alright, it came out no problem at all. The next step is to try and actually disconnect this from the steering column. So I have a pry bar here, and we're going to hammer on the end of it and see if we can get it up. I'm not going to remove it all the way right now, just because I'm not sure, we might have to pull the steering rack off So it was definitely moving, so I'm not too concerned about it. The next thing we're going to do, if you come to the passenger side of the rack, there should be one 12 millimeter bolt right up here. This is just holding some of the power steering lines in place, and we're gonna go ahead and disconnect that from the rack. Okay, this is actually a 10 millimeter bolt up here, guys. And again, this bolt is just to hold some of these power steering lines in place. We are going to now start removing all of the bolts and nuts that hold the power steering rack in place. And again, the reason I'm doing this before disconnecting the tie rods is that I just want to make sure all of these bolts and nuts come off. None of them are seized on there. I'm going to start on the passenger side here with these two. I think this is a nut and a bolt, and I believe they're both 19 millimeters. All right, first one came off no problem. This is just a nut here. All right, the top one is a bolt here, and that should allow us to remove this clamp here. We are going to be reusing this. All right, I believe the next, I think this is a bolt that we are going to be disconnecting, is the center one that holds the steering rack in place. You can access it with a wrench on the top here, and it is a 19 millimeter socket. So I don't have any extensions or anything, just the 19 millimeter to get to that. So let's try and get this guy loose. We might need the breaker bar for this one. I got the breaker bar. This thing is pretty tight. Let's see if we can get it with this. Okay, it's starting to move. It was just really tight. All right, sweet. Okay, so this is a bolt, and then there is a washer on there as well. The next bolt, and I think this might be the last one that's holding the steering rack in place, is this big. I think it's just a nut right here because I think this sits on a stud, and this is a 22 millimeter. Yep, so this is just a nut and a washer as well, so this steering rack sits on this stud here. Now that we have removed the bolts that hold the steering rack in place, and I know that none of those are seized or super rusted on there, we can go ahead and move on to removing the outer tie rods. I'm going to be replacing these outer tie rods because I figure mine are already super worn out. So I'll show you guys that later in this video, but for now we are going to remove these outer tie rods. So if you come to the back side of your brake rotor, you'll see here where the steering rack extends out and connects to the lower ball joint. Now there is a cotter pin and a castle nut. Mine is a lot newer since I just did the lower ball joints about a year ago. But if you haven't done this, this cotter pin is probably going to be super rusty, and you might even have to cut it out, or it might take a little bit of work. So first step is to remove that cotter pin and then go ahead and take that castle nut off. So let's start with the cotter pin. There we go. Finally, it is out. Cotter pin is removed here. Next step is to remove this castle nut holding the outer tie rod in place, and it should be a 19 millimeter. All right, castle nut came off no problem. Again, I have replaced this somewhat recently. Now we are going to try and separate the outer tie rod from the lower ball joint. Sometimes this can be a little bit tricky. So we are going to thread the castle nut back on and then hit it with a hammer. The reason we are threading the castle nut on is if we hit that bolt too much, it can kind of balloon out and expand and make it even more difficult to get out from the lower ball joint. So if we thread this castle nut on, it provides some more surface area and prevents that from happening. Then when it does pop out too, it won't just shoot down. So castle nut is on. Let's go ahead and hit it with a hammer, see if we can get this separated. At this point in the install, with the wheels facing forwards, there just wasn't a great angle to hammer on those outer tie rod ball joints and get those separated. You have a couple options at this point in the install. The first is just to get a ball joint separator tool. These are perfect for this type of job, like removing a ball joint on your tie rod. You can pick these up for pretty cheap at O'Reilly's, AutoZone. Any type of auto store should carry these. Unfortunately, I did not have my ball joint separator tool with me for this job. So what I did instead is I reconnected my steering rack to the steering shaft, just re-threaded that bolt in to hold it all together. Once it was all reconnected, I then turned the wheel to full lock, and this gave me a lot more space. Again, make sure you keep that castle nut on there. You don't want to balloon out that outer tie rod bolt. That could make it a lot harder to actually remove the outer tie rod. So castle nut on, beat it with a hammer, turn the wheel if you need to get more space, and this should pop out. And if you're having a hard time with it, you can also get a ball joint separator tool, and that will make the job even easier. So this is not what a steering rack should do. These inner tie rods in here should be stiff, and as you guys can see, I can effortlessly move these around. As for the outer tie rods, these should be super stiff as well, and I can easily move this with my fingers. So inner and outer tie rods are completely shot. I can't say I'm super surprised. I have a feeling this could even be the OEM rack with close to 200,000 miles on it. Same thing on the passenger side. The inner tie rods are completely blown. They should not be this loose at all. And then the outer tie rods here, the ball joint, you should not be able to move it around like this with your finger this easily. So on both sides, driver and passenger, both the inner tie rods and the outer tie rods on my steering rack here are completely blown. This 12mm bolt up here that we removed earlier, I just temporarily threaded back into place just when I was rotating the steering wheel. Now we can go ahead and remove that again. All right, there it is. I also temporarily reinstalled this 22mm bolt just to hold this in place when I was beating on the outer tie rod there. So we can go ahead and remove this again. And again, this is a nut and a washer on the side. Next thing we are going to do here is disconnect these two power steering fluid lines, and these are going to drip quite a bit of fluid out of them, so just make sure you have a bucket or something to catch all of that fluid with. I'm going to be using one of these open-ended flare wrenches, and I think both of these should be 17mm. There's a lot of extra power steering fluid here, so we're going to hit it with some brake clean and just get this area nice and cleaned up.
So now, take it down. There you go.
Oh, sweet.
It just got a little seized here.
Here is the old steering rack and the new steering rack. Now these steering racks from Freelance Fab are awesome. They're fully OEM racks that are rebuilt and painted in a black paint as well, so they look awesome. They also come with polyurethane bushings pre-installed, so everything is ready to go. You can go ahead and just bolt this rack up. All of the inner tie rods are taken care of. I have new outer tie rods, so we'll throw those on in a little bit. But check out this difference, guys. So here is the old steering rack. The inner tie rods are underneath this boot here, and look how easily I can move these. These are completely blown. It is not supposed to be like that. Now with the new rack, I can't even move these inner tie rods. Look at, if I put pressure on this, it lifts the entire rack on the other side. That's how stiff these are supposed to be. I can't even imagine trying to do that with this one, with how blown these tie rods are. So this is the new rack. It looks awesome. Again, comes with the bushings ready to go. Freelance Fab, I definitely recommend checking this out. This is an awesome OEM Plus upgrade. For the outer tie rods, these are the outer tie rods here. they are not included with the steering rack. If yours aren't completely blown like mine are, you could reuse them, but you can see here, mine, you can easily move them around. This is not what they're supposed to be like. So I picked up a set of these. They're called Master Pro Outer Tierods. They're from O'Reilly's. They're kind of a budget option, but I am okay using a cheaper outer tie rod, and here is why. The reason I am okay using a cheaper outer tie rod like these budget options from O'Reilly's is just in the event that one of your steering component breaks, outer tie rod, inner tie rod, something like that, I would much rather have it be an outer tie rod because it's a lot cheaper and easier to replace than an entire steering rack. The steering rack should be the strongest component of the steering system, and I would much rather have the outer tie rod break before the steering rack. The outer tie rod is just a lot cheaper and a lot easier to replace than a steering rack. Even some of the name brand, more expensive outer tie rods can still have plenty of issues. They may last a little bit longer, but they can be a lot more expensive. Lots of the budget outer tie rods seem to get decent reviews, so that is what I'm going to be running. Now, before we throw the steering rack back into the Sequoia, I am going to get these outer tie rods threaded onto the new steering rack. One other important thing you gotta do before you throw your steering rack into your vehicle is to center the rack. So what we've done here is I've clamped some vice grips to kind of the steering column, and we are going to rotate it all the way until we reach the end, until we can't turn it anymore. So right about there is fully extended. Now what we're going to do is spin it all the way to the other side and count the number of turns. We're pretty much lined up straight with the steering rack, and we are going to spin it all the way to the other side, counting the turns. Here we go. There's one rotation. There's 2, 3, and maybe 30% or so. So what we're going to do now is divide that number by 2. We divide 3.33 in half and we get 1.66. So we are going to do one turn and then 66% of another turn, and that will be centered. So we're going to do one turn, and now we're going to do 66% of a turn and do our best to get this centered. Half of a turn, that's 50%. And now we need to go a little bit more, maybe right around there. With our steering rack now centered, we can start throwing on the outer tie rods. And again, our goal here is just to try and get them as close as we can. It's not going to be perfect. You're really going to need an alignment to fix this. For now, we're just going to get those outer tie rods on, get them installed and tightened down, and get it close enough just so we can drive it to the shop for an alignment. The outer tie rod should come with a nut as well. And the first step here is we are going to thread that on. Next, we can go ahead and thread on the outer tie rod. Again, these tie rods do go on a certain side. There is a driver's side and there is a passenger side. So I'll show you the direction of these once they're attached. And how these are attached is they just kind of thread together and tighten together. What we're going to do here though is we're going to take a measurement from the old steering rack and measure that distance from where the threads start to the start of the outer tie rod. I'll show you guys how to do that. And we're just gonna go off the old steering rack as our best guess. Again, it's not going to be perfect, and an alignment shop will fix this. So on the old steering rack, I am going to measure the distance from where the outer tie rod starts to the start of the threads. The nut sizes on the old outer tie rods and the new outer tie rods are different. You can see this one is skinnier and this one is a lot thicker. So we're gonna not use that nut at all. We're just gonna measure from where the threads start to the outer tie rod. So let's go ahead and get that measurement. Just under an inch maybe. Yeah, it looks like it's right around 1 inch. So again, it's not going to be perfect, but we are going to do our best to just kind of try and match the old steering rack. All right, so that one we have not tightened down all the way, but it's just kind of snugged up and into place. Now we're gonna do the exact same thing on the passenger side. we're going to install that Zork fitting. Just thread that in so that we can grease these. And then we start by threading on the nut. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to measure the distance from where the threads start to the outer tie rod on the passenger side. And we're going to do our best to kind of match it. And next step, we are going to replace these. So I'll show you where they are installed on the truck. If you guys look here at the two power steering fluid lines that are coming from the truck, you guys can see on the ends of them are these two little donut gaskets. We are going to remove the old ones and install the new ones. Alright, it's as easy as that. We have replaced the two gaskets on the power steering lines. And again, these little gaskets are included in the kit from Freelance Fab. Next step is to bolt up the new steering rack. That would have been a lot easier with the second set of hands. From the old rack, you do have to take this kind of U-clamp. I don't know exactly what this is called. You do have to remove this from the old rack and reinstall it onto the new rack. So. I'm just going to start by snugging up all of these bolts, and then we'll go ahead and torque them down. On the power steering rack here, there are these little caps. We can go ahead and remove both of these. There's not really a great way to torque either of these power steering fluid lines, so go ahead and snug them up, get them nice and tight. We don't want fluid leaking from either of these. We are going to now torque down all of the bolts. Now we are going to thread in that 12mm bolt that holds the steering column to the steering rack. Those are all the bolts, and everything is torqued down for the power steering rack. Next up here, we are going to reconnect the outer tie rods and then tighten those down. So as you guys can see here, just as an example with the steering rack installed, look how much harder it is to move these inner tie rods. Remember, with the old ones, they were pretty much bouncing. Look how much force it takes to move these. By tightening the tie rod here, we're actually adjusting the toe of our vehicle. So this is what they'll do when I take it to a shop for an alignment. But as we pull this in and tighten it, we're pulling the back side of the wheel closer to the middle of the vehicle, meaning the front of the wheel is going farther towards the outside. This is actually how you make the adjustment for the toe of your vehicle. And right now we are just going to kind of eyeball it, trying to get that wheel facing somewhat straight. I have an alignment scheduled for tomorrow, so it's not a huge concern. They will fix this and make it actually straight at the alignment shop. You do also need to pull off this clamp on the boot. Otherwise, when you tighten down this tie rod here, the boot will get all twisted. So, okay. That is nice and tight. Next, we can go ahead and tighten down this nut that holds our outer tie rod to the lower ball joint. This new nylon locking nut with my new outer tie rods is a 22mm. We are going to torque this to 67 foot-pounds. One of the last things we need to do here is just bolt up these power steering fluid lines to the new rack. You do need to transfer over this little mounting bracket from the old steering rack here, and it just bolts up. With the new steering rack all tightened down along with the outer tie rods, we can now move on to the last step, which is going to be bleeding the power steering fluid. So I am going to show you guys what that process looks like. The first thing we are going to do is come to our power steering fluid reservoir. It's located on the passenger side of the vehicle right here. I went ahead and removed my cap earlier just to help some of that fluid drain out a little bit quicker. The first thing we are going to do here is go ahead and just start to fill this reservoir up. Now it's going to be a little bit hard to film this process, so I figure I'll describe it for you guys. There are also a lot of other videos on YouTube about how to bleed power steering systems if you're interested in a more specific video. But basically what we're doing is we filled the reservoir up just a little bit. We are going to jump to the inside of the Sequoia, and without starting it, turn the steering wheel all the way to the left and all the way to the right, and basically repeat that process. Now while you're doing that, it's really important that you don't let the steering reservoir run dry. You don't want that to run out of fluid. As you turn that wheel back and forth, just continue to come to the engine bay and check those fluid levels. It's going to take a little bit here, and it's going to be a lot of running from the inside, turning the steering wheel back to the engine bay and refilling the reservoir. So just take your time with it. Understand it's going to take a little bit, and that is the process of bleeding the power steering system. We can now undo this, and now we can turn the Sequoia to accessory mode and start the process of turning the wheel. After I start it, I'm going to immediately go check the power steering fluid reservoir and just make sure not a ton of fluid got sucked down, because again, we don't want to run that dry. Alright, well that sucked a ton of it down, maybe too much. Let's add some more in there. The fluid was all the way full, and I had been turning the wheel back and forth for a couple minutes, and it barely moved. I then started the vehicle, and all of it got sucked down, so I quickly turned it off. I just refilled it, turned the wheel back and forth maybe like 2 times, and it pretty much drained the entire reservoir. So I don't know what was going on, but I definitely was expecting it to drain a lot faster the first time, and it seems like it's doing that now. So I'm going to continue topping it off here, turning the wheel back and forth and seeing what it does here. I've been turning the wheel back and forth, and it's starting to feel more consistent and a little bit stiffer, more like it does when you don't have the car turned on. So now I'm going to try starting the Sequoia again, and as soon as I start it, run over here and make sure it doesn't do the same thing it did last time where it just sucked a bunch of the fluid down into the system. So let's go ahead and try starting the Sequoia again here. This time I started it and the fluid did not get sucked down, so we are going to turn the wheel back and forth again, but with the engine running. Well, it took a while. It was not the most fun process, but I'm pretty sure we have successfully bled the power steering fluid. And the power steering system, Lance, the guy behind Freelance Fab and the guy who makes these steering racks, recommended that I just put on a TV show or YouTube video, and that is exactly what I did. So sat in there, turned the wheel back and forth for, like I said, 20 to 30 minutes or so. I quickly want to update you guys on the last thing with this steering rack install that was bugging me, and just talk a little bit about it. So what that was I got the steering rack aligned, everything was dialed, and when I got it back, I started to notice that I had slightly more turns to the left than I did to the right. So I counted from lock to lock, and the Sequoia makes just under 3.5 turns. It's like 3.4 turns, so just about 3.5. And basically, I could turn 1.8 times to the left, so over 1 3/4 to the left. And I couldn't even turn 1 3/4 to the right. I could turn about 1.5, just a little bit over 1.5 times to the right. So basically what was happening is I had the ability to make a sharper turn to the left than I did to the right. And I don't know why, this was one of those little things that just really bugged me, because what it means is that the steering rack was not perfectly centered. Now, one of the things I was showing you guys in this video is how to center the steering rack. I clamped the vice grips to the rack, rotated it all the way to the left, all the way to the right, and then divided that number by 2, and that gave me the center, roughly the center of the steering rack. Now, one of the biggest issues I had, or one of the biggest questions I had with this, is those splines on the steering rack are so small. I just did not see any way how using the vice grips, counting those turns and dividing that in half would give you a specific or precise enough measurement to perfectly center the steering rack when those splines are so small. So basically what I found is that I was off by a little bit. That explains why I could turn more to the left than to the right. So I know this is going on, and I'm gonna get to the point here and talk about what I did to fix this. So I basically turned the wheel all the way to the left to full lock, 1.8 turns. I knew it had 3.4 turns to go all the way to the other side. And I knew that if I started from 1.8 and I turned it 1.7 times, that would be the position where the steering rack would be perfectly centered. So that's what I did. I turned it all the way to full lock, 1.8 turns, and then I turned it from there back 1 3/4 to the right, and that is the position where the steering rack is centered. The steering wheel was now off-centered, but what I knew by doing this is that this was the center of the rack. So basically what I did is I disconnected that steering shaft, slid it up, and spun it to rotate the steering wheel to match with the steering rack. So the steering rack is straight, we know that. All we had to do now is correct the steering wheel and get that straight as well. So that's what I did. I know this was a long explanation, but I just wanted to kind of try and give you guys the most detail possible on this. By doing this though, my alignment is now going to be off, but luckily it should be an easy fix for this. All we have to do is just adjust the toe of the vehicle, just bring each of those wheels over an equal amount. So I'll probably go back to an alignment shop to have this done, and I'll give you guys an update after that. It just feels really good now to finally know that the steering rack is centered with the steering wheel, because that was one of those little things that was just going to really bug me. So that's how I fixed it. You can still use the vice grips to get like a general rough measurement, but this was kind of the best way I found to kind of get a more precise measurement is after installing it on the vehicle. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll do my best to answer them. I'm no expert by any means, but just wanted to share this little extra bit with you guys. Well, that is going to wrap it up for this video. That was the process of installing a freelance fab steering rack on my first gen or 2002 Toyota Sequoia. I am extremely excited to have a brand new steering rack on my Sequoia. As you guys saw, my old steering rack was totally worn out, so having this rebuilt OEM steering rack with the polyurethane bushings will be a huge upgrade. If you guys are looking for a new steering rack, I really encourage you to check out Freelance Fabrications. Along with steering racks, they also have a ton of awesome products for these first gen Sequoias and Tundras. So definitely go check out Freelance Fab. I'll have a link to their website in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's a great free way to help support my channel, and your support really does mean a lot. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.